started 1997. Is that correct?
Yeah, 95, 96.
95 to 97.
It's been going about 30 years. So when the heck is it going to end, Frank? Let me know.
Right. Well, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it just as much as everybody else is, I think.
Yeah.
But so you're kind of in agreement with me. There seems to be some light at the end of the tunnel for these active hurricane seasons that we're dealing with. At least we hope. Good evening, y'all. Welcome to Carolina Weather Group. I'm Frank Strait here with you tonight. I'll be hosting duties with James busy with family stuff and Scotty out of town doing a conference. And so you got me, the third stringer here doing this hosting duty tonight. With me tonight on the panel is Shay Gibson down in Charleston. I'm in Columbia. And our guest tonight is Phil Klotzbach, leader of the Hurricane Forecasting Unit at Colorado State University. And we're going to be talking about his forecast for the hurricane season, which it looks like it's going to be a big season for a lot of reasons, but I'm not going to go into those details. I'm going to let Phil talk about that. So, Phil, why don't you go ahead and get started and give us an introduction to you and what you're doing there at Colorado State.
So I'm Phil Klotzbach. I'm now a senior research scientist. You get the senior when you've been sticking around for a long time. At Colorado State in the Department of Atmospheric Science. I've been there since 2000. And so our group at CSU does seasonal hurricane predictions. These predictions started all the way back in 1984, long before I was on the scene, pioneered by Dr. Bill Gray. And we continue to do these year in and year out. And so this year, as you mentioned, there are indications that we're likely to have a very, very busy hurricane season in store. So we just put out our latest forecast a couple of days ago. And we continue to forecast a very, very busy hurricane season, numbers well above average, primarily due to the fact that the North Atlantic is extremely warm right now. We have a record warm sea surface temperature anomalies across large chunks of the basin. And a warmer Atlantic provides more fuel for storms, also tends to lower the pressures and make for a more unstable atmosphere, all of which are typically associated with very busy hurricane seasons.
So I see your named storm forecast. You're calling for 23 named storms this year. 11 hurricanes and 5 of them becoming major hurricanes. And so that would be even more active than last year. We had 20 named storms last year, and that's well above average. The number of hurricanes and major hurricanes, though, was closer to average last year. 7 hurricanes, if I remember correctly. The average is 7.2, and then we had 3 majors last year, correct? And 3.2 is the average, if I remember correctly.
Yes, correct. You remember correctly. Yes, that's right. So last year was high on the named storms. We actually had a lot of named storm days. So those storms were around a long time. But the intensity of the storms was closer to average. If we use that integrated metric of accumulated cyclone energy, it did meet NOAA's definition of an above average season, which was quite remarkable because it happened in a strong El Nino year. The first time on record, we had a strong El Nino in the tropical Pacific. That's warmer water there that normally knocks down your Atlantic hurricanes due to increases in wind shear. Last year, despite the strong El Nino, the Atlantic was so dang warm that we ended up with an above normal season and actually well below normal shear. We actually have a paper on last year's hurricane season that's currently under review, where we go into that in a lot of detail, trying to kind of look at exactly what happened and why the season played out the way it did. Because the prevailing wisdom was prior to last year, when you have a strong El Nino, it tends to dominate over everything else. And obviously last year, not so much. The El Nino actually kind of played a little bit of second fiddle to the Atlantic last year in terms of hurricane activity, both in the Atlantic as well as in the Pacific Ocean.
Right. Yeah, that usually does not happen. Usually your overwhelming signal is ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation. And last year, the Atlantic was large and in charge because it was just so much warmer than usual, sort of like what we're dealing with now. I think actually the water temperature anomalies out there are even warmer this year than they were last year, right?
Yes, that's correct. This is your current sea surface temperatures. This is from Kim Wood's great plots that she does. So here, let's see. So this is sea surface temperatures. Oh, this is in the eastern and central tropical Atlantic. So there we actually are running now a little bit behind last year. So the blue line is 2024, the red line is 2023. And then all those other years are individual years from 1991 to 2022, I believe. And then the average is that black line. So if we look at the black line, we are running well ahead of normal. We're about 2 2 months to 2.5 months ahead of schedule for tropical Atlantic sea surface temperatures, kind of depending on which box you use. So this is more an Eastern Atlantic box. We're still running ahead of 2023 in that region. So we're just running well ahead of normal. And if we look at, in addition to sea surface temperatures, ocean heat contents are still also running 2 to 2.5 months ahead of normal, which Brian McNulty at University of Miami has put together these nice ocean heat content plots this year, which is fantastic because, sea surface temperatures being warm is one thing, but even like the depth, the ocean heat content is also extremely warm. So really just kind of highlighting, in addition to at the ocean surface, the entire ocean is much, much warmer than normal. So even if we do get a little bit stronger winds for a few days or whatever, you're likely to still have a lot of warm water. And especially, honestly, the Caribbean is pretty striking as well. We're running there, on average. If you look at the average sea surface temperatures, we look at 2024, we're ahead of climatology for at any point in the season already. So that's pretty sobering. So again, we are running really, really hot, and obviously, especially with the Caribbean being so hot, that tends to modulate the atmospheric circulation in such a way that it makes it extremely conducive for storm activity. Caribbean is always plenty warm. Even if you look at the climatology, 28.5, 29 degrees Celsius is the average. But this year, we're already well above 29 degrees Celsius. So plenty of fuel for storms. Fuel is not going to be the challenge. Obviously, the big thing is, how will the atmospheric circulation respond? NOAA officially today declared El Nino toast. So we're now in what's called ENSO neutral. So as you mentioned earlier, El Nino Southern Oscillation is now neutral, which means neither El Nino nor La Nina. So this is the discussion that just came out today, the final El Nino advisory. We now have a La Nina watch. And so NOAA for August through October has a 75% chance of La Nina by that period. Normally, La Nina is colder water in the eastern and central tropical Pacific Ocean. And when that occurs, it tends to basically generate vertical wind shear patterns that are much more conducive for storms. But I think regardless if we get officially to La Nina or just in neutral conditions, we're likely to have extremely favorable shear patterns, just given overall how hot the Atlantic is. And we're kind of sorry to see that already shaping up. If you look at the forecast from, say, the European model for the next few weeks, the shears that are being forecast are well below normal across the Western Atlantic, Caribbean, extending farther to the east. And I think we're starting to kind of see signs that the tropical atmosphere is starting to look a little more like what we would expect it to look like for such conducive conditions. So obviously it's still very early. We're only in mid-June, but we are now starting to actually see signs of life in the tropics. And obviously the Hurricane Center right now is already monitoring 2 areas of potential tropical cyclone formation in the next week. I don't know if you want to talk about those or...
The Saharan air layer is something that we watch very carefully because we get these large plumes like you're seeing right now. Probably not going to see a lot of activity, but I wanted to ask you about this. How, is there a way that you can kind of see if this is going to be stronger or weaker through the summer?
So if we look at the dust so far, so there's not as great comparings with climatology with dust as are some of these other indices like sea surface temperatures. But from what we've seen so far in the limited data that I could see, it looks like the dust has actually been a little bit below average. As you know, right now, there's a pretty pronounced plume right near Cabo Verde. That's pretty normal for June. There's a reason we don't get a lot of named storm formations off of Africa in June. Last year was extremely rare to get 2 east of the islands. Normally, as we start to shift the upward motion more over Africa, will likely get more vigorous easterly waves or thunderstorm complexes coming off the coast. But often when you have these vigorous easterly waves, behind them, they actually drag dust out behind them. So just because you see dust in the eastern Atlantic, that will tend to squelch storm activity in the short term, but it's not necessarily a harbinger of, say, a quiet season. 2020 had one of the biggest dust outbreaks on record in late June, and obviously the season was quiet for a couple of weeks there, but obviously 2020 was anything but a quiet hurricane season. If what you tend to see is if you see a lot of this dust making it all the way across into, say, the Caribbean, that tends to be more a harbinger of a quiet season because that means you tend to have a strong, like, mid-level jet. So in this color scheme, it's really the dark reds that are the pronounced dust. As you get more to the yellows, that's not necessarily a ton of dust.
Right.
But if you look at climatologically, where we are right now, the dust seems like it's been a little bit lower than normal. If you talk about the, as you mentioned, with time, the intertropical convergence zone, where basically these low-level winds converge, is looking like is climatologically, or an average always shifts to the north. So far, it's been about average. It looks like it will tend to shift to the north a bit faster as we started to see. While the tropical Atlantic is extremely warm, the equatorial tropical Atlantic has begun to at least anomalously cool. So that should tend to push that intertropical convergence zone north, which should also kind of help invigorate some of these waves as they're coming off. So again, it's early. It's June 13th when we're doing this one. So, maybe in a couple of weeks, we'll start to see more signs. But again, it is still pretty early. If you look at the long range ensembles, there's not much development east of the islands, but that's very normal for June. It's really rare to get anything east of the islands until at least the latter part of July, more likely in August.
For those watching, this is the CSU predictions for this year. NOAA came out with theirs. They have theirs that they do. And so what I was referring to earlier is on the higher end, the named storms at 23, major hurricanes at 5, hurricanes overall at 11, major hurricanes at 5. And one of the parameters here that I really like that you do is you track the ACE, so the accumulated cyclone energy. So the longer hurricanes are over water, the longer that they are a named storm, or the stronger they are, they can generate more of this accumulated cyclone energy over time. You have it pinned for 210, which is rather, I'm not sure if that's a high on your scale for this type of setup for this year, but also you have ACE west of 60 degrees longitude. So I wanted to kind of see what your thoughts were, like explain how you come up with ACE,
Sure.
And then how you factor that into your forecast.
Yeah. So ACE is an integrated metric accounting for storm frequency, intensity, and duration. So if you're a baseball fan, you can think of it as kind of like the OPS of hurricanes. And so it's a way to kind of get at the overall kind of length. So storms like an Irma in 2017 or Dorian that are around for a long time, extremely powerful, generate a ton of ACE, whereas kind of weak, short-lived storms generate very low levels of that ACE index. And the reason why ACE matters is because when you're generating a lot of wind energy, especially when you have that other forecast for west of 60 degrees, that's quite important, obviously, because if you're expending a lot of wind energy in the western half of the basin, then you're likely getting, storms causing potential significant impacts. So if you think about, again, a storm like Dorian spent a ton of wind energy over Abaco, Grand Bahama, and obviously caused catastrophic damage there. So we forecast ACE for the Atlantic basin, and those other numbers, the named storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes, all derive basically from they regressed against kind of their historical relationships with that ACE index. So all our models, our goal, basically we forecast ACE, then all the other numbers come from that ACE value. So when you have an ACE of 210, quote unquote, normally that's how it plays out, 23, 11, and 5. Now, obviously you could have 28, 10, and 4. You could have 32, 9. You just don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but that's kind of how an overall season will play out with an ACE of 210.
Phil, one last question for you, and this actually applies more, I think, to beyond 2024. But the reason why we're expecting it to be so active this year is because of the warm waters, and that's part of a cycle that we're familiar with called the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation or Atlantic multidecadal variability, depending on who you ask about it. But it's a cycle that lasts about 60 years from start to finish, where the waters in the Atlantic are warmer than average for about 30 years, and they flip to being colder than average for about 30 years. So that cycle, the warm cycle that we're in now, started 1997. Is that correct?
Yeah, 95, 96.
95 to 97.
So it's been going about 30 years. So when the heck is it going to end, Frank? Let me know.
Right. Well, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it just as much as everybody else is, I think.
Yeah.
But so you're kind of in agreement with me. There seems to be some light at the end of the tunnel for these active hurricane seasons that we're dealing with. At least we hope.
Yeah,
have reason to believe.
Theoretically, we should be starting to kind of move out of it. And we thought, and we actually published a paper in the end of 2015. We said end of Atlantic hurricane, or active Atlantic hurricane era at its end. And we put a question mark at the end. And I'm glad we did, because the answer was a resounding no. But we had 3 quiet seasons in a row. And the Atlantic had kind of anomalously cooled. It had gone back more towards normal. But the last few years, obviously, the Atlantic has warmed back up. The far North Atlantic, which often tends to drive the tropical Atlantic, has gotten somewhat cooler, but the tropical Atlantic has been kind of beating to its own drum. And really, what kind of put us in this crazy mode that we've been in is about February of last year was kind of if you look at the main development region where the hurricanes form, it's about average. March of last year, the subtropical high in the Atlantic basically just collapsed, and it hasn't rebounded since. And so when the subtropical high is weaker, you tend to get weaker winds blowing across the tropical Atlantic in response, and that just lends less evaporation. So you get less evaporation off the ocean surface. It warmed and warmed and warmed super fast, and it just hasn't cooled down. It did cool down in the winter, but the anomalies or the relative to normal, it stayed very elevated. And so why hasn't it? Why hasn't the subtropical ridge built up? It's a bit unclear. Normally El Nino, it tends to be weaker. So with the La Nina coming in, we would expect maybe the subtropical ridge will get a bit stronger. Maybe this coming winter, we'll see those anomalies go back more towards normal. But again, there's a lot of questions. What exactly? And obviously, if the subtropical ridge gets stronger and it gets stronger in the summer, well, that's not great because then those storms are going to get driven further west. So that's kind of one of the big question marks. But right now we're at a really, if you look at 2005 and 1995, some of these monster seasons and plot the sea surface temperatures then, which at that point we thought were wow warm, and you compare them with now, it's like a whole new ballgame. Like it's so much warmer. So again, we'll see how all this plays out. But again, right now overall conditions certainly look like we're setting up for kind of prime territory for a very busy season.
All right. Well, tell the folks how to find you on social media and otherwise, if you'd like.
Yeah. So our website is tropical.colostate.edu. You can also just Google CSU hurricane forecast or use your favorite search engine. I should give a plot for DuckDuckGo or whatever other search engine you want to use. We also, I am on Twitter /X/ whatever Elon wants to call it this week. I'm at Twitter at Phil Klotzbach. So my first and my last name combined. Sorry, I chose my Twitter handle long before I realized I'd post a lot of content on there. So that's probably the best way to follow. I try to provide a fair amount of real-time content during the hurricane season. And then, our next forecast will come out on July 9th and a final update on August the 6th. We also do 2-week forecasts where we try to pinpoint during the season when we're likely to see the most activity. So we'll start those on August the 6th and we'll update it every 2 weeks. So we'll try to highlight, and when you start getting to that time period, we're going from forecasting, okay, the Atlantic looks busy to, hey, let's look at the next 2 weeks. Which parts of the Atlantic are busy? What might be going on there? So that we can start to go more from just like the basin looks busy to potential areas that may be threatened.
Well, we appreciate all your hard work. Your stats are amazing. If you're watching, you never tuned into Dr. Klotzbach. It comes out with just the coolest stats all summer long, all the way through. You'll find some pretty interesting information. So.
Yeah, it's absolutely great. And we do thank you for coming on with us tonight, Phil. And it's always a great discussion to talk about the nuts and bolts of hurricane forecasting and the seasonal aspect of it. And it's really valuable information that we find. Although one thing we want to stress, the hurricane seasonal forecast does not change how you prepare, because even in a quiet season, just that one storm, there'll be one big storm, just like Andrew in 92, Hugo in 89. And 89 was fairly mundane other than Hugo. So just keep in mind that one storm is all it takes. So always prepare no matter what that seasonal forecast shows you. All right. So we're going to call it a night here. And again, thanks to Phil for coming on. So we're going to say goodnight. And Phil, again, thanks for joining us. I'm Frank Strait, joined by Shay Gibson tonight. Thanks for joining us, everyone, here in Carolina Weather Group.